Welcome, everyone. We will give it another 30 seconds and then I will kick things off. We're just waiting for people to filter in from the waiting room. It always sounds so exclusive, the waiting room. Thank you all for being here. Oh, and we're already getting love and reactions. That's exciting. This is the first time I've gotten love and reactions for a legal webinar, so we're thrilled to have you all. Okay, well, I am going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nora Benavides. I work at Free Press. I'm our Senior Counsel and Director of Digital Justice and Civil Rights. I'm so honored to be here with a couple of experts. We're going to be talking about this possible TikTok ban. And if you're just tuning in, you are joining us for our live webinar, Social Media and the First Amendment, breaking down the TikTok ban. This is hosted by Free Press. We are joined by our wonderful colleagues at Free Press and the Knight First Amendment Institute. I just want to take a moment and give you some ground rules for what to expect. This event is strictly C3. We are recording this event for all of you and for those in the future that may not be able to make it. So we'll be posting this on our YouTube page at Free Press. We'll be following up with all of you after the webinar to make sure that you have a copy of the recording. Thank you all for joining our event, Social Media and the First Amendment, breaking down the TikTok ban. Ooh, well, I'm here with two tremendous luminaries in the legal field. I want to introduce George Wang from the Knight First Amendment Institute. I got to be honest, my Knight colleagues, I fangirl all the time at you guys. You're just the coolest, the best, the smartest. I'm blushing and I'm introducing you. So I'm really excited that you're here, George. George is a staff attorney there and a master of all, I would say. So we're really excited that George is giving us some time to break down, what's going on with TikTok. Is it going to get banned? And then with me as well is Yanni Chen, who is one of my close colleagues at Free Press. I feel so honored that Yanni was willing to do this event with me. In conceiving of and trying to brainstorm how we make sense of what's really happening with social media and the First Amendment, I wanted Yanni here. She's been in the trenches with George and with other lawyers on the case that we're going to be discussing today. So I want to dive in, and I think, I'm going to turn it first, Yanni, to you. I would love for you to set the stage for us just a little bit. How did this entire situation come about? I know that what we're looking at is a law currently being challenged by TikTok that would force TikTok to either be sold and divested here in the US or be banned. And I'm really curious, can you break down this origin story? What was the impetus for lawmakers to advance this proposal and ultimately to sign this into law?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for having me and that nice introduction, Nora. I'll just start with a little bit of background and then kind of get into some analogs too that have popped up on the state level as well. So in 2020, the Trump administration actually considered banning TikTok, and there was talk of divestment then. Trump issued an executive order prohibiting certain transactions with ByteDance. There was litigation about that. And then when Biden came into office in 2021, he actually withdrew that EO and issued a new one that identified China as a foreign adversary that threatened the United States through its social or software applications that were used in the United States. So that kind of set the stage for the law to develop that we're about to talk about, that law being the TikTok ban. I think there have been also other there have been some state efforts as well to ban TikTok. There have been quite a few on the state level that ban government and university employees from using TikTok on their devices. But the first public ban we actually did see was in 2023. Montana banned public use of TikTok. And there was litigation that popped up. The district court ended up granting a preliminary injunction. So the law actually never took effect. And they basically ruled that the ban likely infringes on the First Amendment right of users and businesses there. That holding was then appealed to the Ninth Circuit, and this litigation is now stayed pending the litigation we're talking about now in the DC Circuit. And just to, Nora, you did a great job explaining what the law does, but just to talk about some of the process issues that we at Free Press had with the formation of this law in the House. The bill was rushed to a vote after closed-door hearings, so it was really not that transparent. There were also accusations made by lawmakers during the proceeding and to the press that are untrue or unfounded. So there has been no public evidence that China's government has manipulated TikTok content. ByteDance is not owned by the CCP. TikTok is a US company. TikTok US data is stored on servers in the United States controlled by a US company. And then there were also other hearings with TikTok's CEO that made it clear that at least for some lawmakers, this is rooted in xenophobia and sinophobia as well. So you have Senator Cotton not realizing that Singapore and China are different. So I think that's kind of like the lay of the land, if unless I miss something.
Well, I think, Yanni, you teed this up so well. When I first heard about the Montana bill and then ultimately the federal law here that we're discussing today, at first blush thought to myself, this is really troubling. I mean, it would, of course, potentially close off TikTok to users, to content creators. It felt like really concerning from a free expression perspective. And I'm curious, George, I want to really dig into the law, dig into what you think, where you're seeing this from a First Amendment perch. It feels almost like, as Yanni started explaining, there's this tension between security, national security interests, and then free speech. And my gut instinct here, and of course, these issues are central and close to my heart, is that this law is solving a problem that really isn't related to some of the underlying issues presented by the entire ecosystem. So, George, can you help break down for us the free expression components? Does this law violate the First Amendment?
Thanks so much, Nora. And I'm so thrilled to be talking with both of you today. You're absolutely right. The law is really troubling. It authorizes the government to ban a wildly popular social media platform used by millions of Americans every day, which poses a serious threat to those Americans' First Amendment rights. TikTok has, by its count, over 170 million American users, and those users undoubtedly exercise their First Amendment rights when they use the platform to express themselves, to get their news, to connect with the people and communities they care about, and yes, even to be entertained. So shutting down TikTok would be a big deal, not just for creators, but everyone who shares or views content on TikTok. And it sets a really dangerous precedent for how we think about regulating speech online. After all, restricting access to foreign media, that's a tactic we ordinarily associate with repressive regimes, including, ironically, the Chinese government. So I think we should be really wary before giving this kind of power to our own government. And it's for that reason that ordinarily, to justify such broad restrictions on First Amendment rights, the government needs to have good reasons. It needs to show that the concerns it's identified are important, and importantly, that they can't be addressed in other narrower ways. And I really don't think the government has made that showing here. And that's precisely the point that we at the Knight Institute, along with you all at Free Press and our colleagues at PEN America, made in our amicus brief to the DC Circuit. The DC Circuit, unfortunately, didn't really see it this way and came to the opposite conclusion recently. In ruling that the TikTok ban didn't violate the First Amendment, it really credited the government's claim that the ban was necessary to protect Americans from TikTok's invasive data collection practices and from what the court called covert content manipulation. And all of this was couched in terms of preserving national security, as you mentioned earlier. And here the DC Circuit basically accepted wholesale the government's view of the circumstances, which it really isn't supposed to do where First Amendment rights are implicated in this broad way. Although I should note, the court conveniently ignored numerous statements made by lawmakers, which Yanni mentioned, that made clear that a key motivation for the ban was to suppress viewpoints those lawmakers didn't like. And that just, I think, further, kind of underscores the First Amendment implications here. The DC Circuit's reasoning really rests on this proposition that the government has a compelling interest in protecting Americans from what it determines to be foreign lies and manipulation, and that this interest justifies suppression of an entire social media platform. Uh, we should understand that banning TikTok, though, is really its own effort to manipulate the kinds of ideas and information that Americans have access to. It's basically saying that, okay, to protect Americans from foreign manipulation, we're going to manipulate you first. TikTok might moderate its content in ways that the government doesn't like, but the government's response can't be to shut the platform down. The First Amendment, really, its entire point is that Americans get to decide for themselves what speech is worth listening to. There are, a whole range of concerns I could point to in the DC Circuit's decision, but I think one of the most disappointing aspects of the ruling was that it didn't really seem to take seriously that the TikTok ban is a form of censorship at all. It
Yeah.
really paid very little attention to the impact of the ban on TikTok's users. Absent a divestment in the next month, the law would shut down the platform entirely and deprive all those millions of American users of their right to engage on the social media platform of their choice. And we usually look to courts to stand up to the government when it infringes on the constitutional rights of millions of Americans. And I'm not sure the DC Circuit did that here. So I hope their decision isn't the final word on this.
Mm. Well, I was really concerned when I saw the ruling from the DC Circuit. If you're just joining us, we are here talking about the First Amendment implications of a recent ruling that we've just heard from last week. The DC Circuit is an appellate level court. For those that are less familiar with the law and our court systems, of course, based in DC, and it carries with it, I think, a kind of credibility and gravitas. Some call it second to the Supreme Court in certain ways, that the nearness to the White House and to the Hill really gives the DC Circuit quite a bit of deference from other courts. So this ruling, of course, is not a ruling from our Supreme Court, but it does bring with it, I think, a host of concerns when we see that George, as you say, there was quite a kind of broad stroke in rejecting any First Amendment violations here when considering a wholesale ban of a platform. Yanni, I guess, I don't want to ask you to read tea leaves completely. I know that's difficult. And given the last several months of our political environment, we've seen people going this way or that way with political scenarios. But I do want to hear just a little bit about what might be next. We're here today talking about this ruling that we've gotten last week from the DC Circuit regarding TikTok and the potential ban in the United States. That ban, if it were upheld, would take effect January 19th of 2025. But can you walk us through the possible different paths that this case might take? Should the case be appealed to the Supreme Court? I think we have some very breaking updates, so I kind of wanted to tease it for you, but I'm really curious, help break down for the audience where this might go following last week and the ruling that we heard from the DC Circuit.
Yeah, for sure. So you're right. Even from the point of the order from the DC Circuit to now, there's been developments. So I'll take those first and then talk about what we can looking forward. So right after the DC Circuit opinion dropped, TikTok actually filed an emergency motion for an injunction with the DC Circuit. And their reasoning essentially is that the incoming Trump administration might have a different position, and they might need to have some time to figure out exactly what that is. And also, just as you mentioned, the looming deadline of this law taking effect is rapidly approaching. And so predictably, the DC Circuit denied this motion because they would have essentially had to say, we might have gotten it wrong. And as you mentioned, the opinion was a unified front. And I think it's viewed as like kind of a strong opinion, maybe not on its merits, but in terms of appearance. So likely this filing was actually just a Hail Mary to get more time to file SCOTUS filings, which leads me to the next point, which is that yesterday, TikTok filed an emergency application for an injunction to the Supreme Court. And I should just back up and say an injunction is essentially when you ask a court to halt the enforcement of a law. So sorry, I get caught up in legal terms sometimes. And so essentially, they asked the court to stop the law from taking effect until the Supreme Court can review the DC Circuit's opinion. This type of filing is known more widely as part of the court's shadow docket. So you might have heard that term used before. Usually there's a normal procedure that's pretty transparent and scheduled throughout called the merits docket on the Supreme Court. The shadow docket doesn't follow this kind of procedure, and it also doesn't have that kind of transparency as well. So there's no oral argument. Often things are decided with very little to no kind of reasoning behind them, and they are typically used in rare moments to address quick rising issues that are emergencies that would cause irreparable harm otherwise. Though that's like a whole nother conversation of whether that's actually how they're used. So the next question essentially will be whether the Supreme Court chooses to hear their case, which is called granting cert, because that's kind of linked to the injunction question. And so essentially, I think if the court thinks that it will grant cert, it will probably grant the injunction to give it that time. And so they're not, like going back after the law is already being enforced and then having to switch course. So I'll just give some reasons why cert is typically granted and why I think that weighs in favor of granting cert here. The court likes to grant cert in important questions of law with widespread national implications. And here you see a first of its kind law, and it affects obviously a wide range of people, their livelihood, their communities. So I think that cuts in favor. Another thing I'll just say is that sometimes the Supreme Court will wait until there's a difference in opinion among the lower courts in the country on a single issue. And they do that so that they can rule more definitively for the entire country as a whole after seeing it kind of pop up on a local level. That's called percolation. And because I love that term, but because this law can only be challenged in the DC Circuit by the text of the law, the court doesn't actually have to wait for other decisions to emerge this time. This is it. And as Nora mentioned before, it went straight to the appeals court this time, skipping a trial court. So the only opportunity for appellate review here would be Supreme Court review. So I think those are like more of the process reasons why it should be granted cert. And I'll just go through the outcome and kind of that tree and what that looks like as well. So at this point of asking for an injunction, the court will either deny or take effect or grant the injunction. And if it denies, that means the law will take effect. If it grants, then the law will not take effect until the court is through with its review. Then it'll proceed to the merits docket if it's granted. And then the court will decide whether to deny cert or grant cert. If you deny cert, then the DC Circuit opinion stands. If you grant cert, then the Supreme Court will be able to actually review with full merits briefing, including oral argument, whether the DC Circuit opinion should be reversed or upheld. And so that's kind of that based on the timing now, I think could possibly play out in the next term of the Supreme Court. And then there's also some other outside considerations as well. The Trump DOJ, as I mentioned earlier, could take a different position. A sale could also moot the immediate concerns of this ban. But I think we would still want the court to weigh in because we think this type of law as a whole is harmful. So I think those are kind of the avenues that this could play out. Yeah.
Well, so it's troubling in certain ways. I think at least we've seen to some extent this Supreme Court be rather protective of First Amendment rights. I still have some nervousness, some reticence about this case going before the Supreme Court. And I want to play out some of the non-legal, more political impacts that we might be dealing with. So if the Supreme Court ultimately, through whatever version, Yanni, that you've laid out, either delays or ultimately upholds this law that presents a forced sale for TikTok. And I want to read a passage from the ruling last week. It really struck me. It was one of the kind of scarier passages. So stay with me here. Um, okay, quote, content on the platform could in principle remain unchanged under divestiture. And for the audience, that would be the forced sale of TikTok to someone else or a different consortium. And then, quote, it goes on, and people in the United States would remain free to read and share as much People's Republic of China propaganda or any other content as they desire on TikTok or any other platform of their choosing. What the act targets is the People's Republic of China's ability to manipulate that content covertly. So I know, George, you spoke already to some of these tensions between what are supposed national security interests, that this law was, created and advanced to protect our national security interests and fight against China's manipulative actions. But I guess I'm wondering from a more political and likely scenario about the next possible owner, whoever purchases TikTok. I just want to open this conversation up in a different way. And let's start with what happened when Twitter was bought. Musk purchased Twitter in 2022. And he systematically took actions to erode platform accountability. He brought back formerly banned accounts that promote and continue to promote extremism and white supremacist values. And studies have shown as recently as this past election cycle that Musk himself promotes his own content to users, irrespective of whether they follow him. And he engages heavily, often in over 50% of his own posts or reshares, with content that is election denialist or espousing far right values. That's just one example of the ways that an existing platform can completely be reshaped. And so I'm thinking now about whoever it is that might step in to buy TikTok. If they do, we see this court saying uh, users and the content on the platform that users have access to will remain unchanged. And I guess I want to push back on that. That feels like a really dangerous presumption that ignores this growing set of special interests and the billionaires that are supporting these special interests, who are shaping and reshaping our information environments. So I want to hear from both of you, both any. What do you make of this uneasy future? And do you believe that the potential divestiture, this forced sale, could ultimately and completely reshape TikTok?
I can start. So Nora, I think your question really touches on an important and fundamental observation. Uh, One that I don't think the DC Circuit in its decision fully grasped, which is that the owner of a social media platform really matters to the overall speech ecosystem on that platform. So your example of what happened with Twitter or X is spot on, right? The change in ownership resulted in a fundamental change in the environment and the community of the platform. That's because content moderation, these decisions by platforms of what content to promote or demote, keep up or take down, is really key to how these platforms operate. So I think it's just not true that all social media platforms are sort of fungible, that they all provide the same things and they all have the same communities. You might choose to be on Twitter or Blue Sky for different reasons, just as someone who's both a creator or user on TikTok might choose TikTok for specific reasons, including the community that they find on TikTok and the speech environment they find on TikTok. So the idea that removing a platform's owner somehow doesn't have implications for free speech, I think woefully misunderstands how social media platforms work, how online communities work, and really the overall nature of online discourse.
Yeah.
As for the question of who might take over TikTok and the viability of the sale, I really have no idea, but there are probably very few companies or individuals who could feasibly do that, especially if there's a compressed timeline. And in any event, we shouldn't assume that TikTok will be the same, as you say, or reflect the same kind of community if it's sold. And more importantly, we shouldn't assume that new ownership is at all going to address these concerns, these cited concerns around TikTok's data collection practices and the opportunities for content moderation, or the issue of the amount of power that social media platforms have to influence and control public discourse online. These are absolutely serious problems that lawmakers should be thinking about, but these problems are not unique to TikTok or ByteDance. And the way to address these concerns is not a broad ban on a popular social media platform, but structural reform of the industry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, I totally echo everything George says. And Nora, I think you're exactly right that Twitter pre and post Musk is the great example of like what could happen with a TikTok purchase. So the downgrades you mentioned, like lip service to online safety efforts, an uptick in hateful speech, an uplifting of extremist speech and Elon Musk's own speech, which undeniably has a political bent to it. I think that's all on the table. And I would also mention that the law itself leaves a lot of discretion to determine whether divestment is satisfactory under the law to Donald Trump. So that also increases the possibility that someone like Elon Musk, someone with ties to Trump, like a Jeff Yass, would be the one setting these standards. And I'll just note that this content moderation question and these questions are essentially the type of concerns that the government says that they're hoping to address with this ban, but they're actually potentially introducing it into the ecosystem with this law instead. And that just goes back to a broader critique that I have with the law, and the courts claim that this law is actually consistent and upholds the principles of the First Amendment. By no means are we endorsing or saying that Chinese government manipulation of the content that the US users can see is a good thing, even though we also don't have public proof of this. What I'm saying is just that the US government can't intervene to address that issue by encroaching on users in constitutional rights. And here I'm not like endorsing or forgiving any Chinese content manipulation if it exists. What I'm saying is just that the law itself sets TikTok up for similar content manipulation issues anyways, and this time at the bidding of the United States government.
Well, you're being so elegant about it, Annie. I'll just say point blank, all of the social media platforms engage in manipulative behavior. Whether it is their algorithms that are placing users into cohorts to show them or exclude from showing them certain content or ads, or other behavior and use of automated tools. It is not in any way exclusive to and unique to TikTok. In fact, both of you highlighted that TikTok here in the United States uses Oracle to house its data collection and storage. And so I wouldn't say that we should dismiss the national security concerns. There were a number of briefings that supposedly yielded, high value information and top secret information about the state of our national security vis-a-vis China. But I think there's just a whole host of other things we're ignoring with a law like this that somehow is solving the problems. And now, I guess, while we're sort of here talking about that, I'm curious, what are some of the other infrastructure, or George, as you described it, whole of systemic solutions? To me, a ban and a ban that targets one individual platform is just it gets lost in a sea of much broader systemic harms from a field that has every incentive to make sure that they have the autonomy and the agency to choose what content we engage with.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the real interventions that just to go back to what I was saying before, I think, and also what Yanni was saying, I think it's absolutely right that we all should be concerned about, for instance, how much data TikTok collects and what kind of data, and as we all discuss, the ways that social media platforms can manipulate data. But the answer to this is more structural industry-wide reform. So, an example is comprehensive privacy legislation, data privacy legislation. If the real concern is data collection practices, why stop at TikTok? Why not capture the whole range of other social media platforms and other digital platforms that engage in many of the very same data collection practices? So if that really is the concern that lawmakers have, and again, I think they're rightly to be concerned about that. The answer isn't to ban one app; it's to engage in this broader structural thinking about what the industry needs to protect users and consumers.
Well, I know as we head into the 47th presidency, there will be, increased scrutiny from civil society on the use of government surveillance and commercial surveillance. And it's in these types of moments that I think a ruling like we saw from the DC Circuit further colors and in a troubling way colors what are existing and very fundamental rights. So I'm curious. By the way, I'll say we're getting lots of questions in the Q&A. Thank you to everyone who is joining, whether you just joined or you've been with us now for the last half hour. We will be getting to questions in the next 15 minutes. I am going to use moderator's privilege to continue grilling and debating my colleagues here because I love hearing their thoughts. But we do have some questions I'll get to soon from others. So thank you. Continue to add your questions in the Q&A function, and I'll be sifting through those in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, well, something we haven't actually addressed here is the human impact. I mean, we've talked a lot about the legal implications, reading the tea leaves of where the Supreme Court might take this, and the political, the macro political and global implications of a possible buyer and what that would do to TikTok. I think I want to open it up to both of you, either of you. Let's start with Yanni, actually. I'd love to really hear, Yanni, what are going to be the potential human aspects if TikTok does get banned or if it changes ownership? How might that impact real people? I'd love to think that I'm an influencer on TikTok, but I'm not. So I'm imagining the influencers and everyone below influencer status, like how will that impact people who are on the platform, whether they're getting content or creating content?
Yeah, and I'll just flag too at the outset, TikTok users and influencers were a party in this case. And I think one thing I was really disappointed about in the opinion itself was I think there was essentially a sentence in the concurring opinion that really actually paid attention to this impact that you're talking about. So yeah, there's so many there's so many things that you could say about how this impacts people on a day-to-day. I'll try and do service to it. I think social media, obviously, we talk a lot about online safety and the guardrails that you need to set here, but at the end of the day, it's also such a huge democratizing power. It lets people reach others in a very even way. It helps you connect with people that are far away from you. It helps people who are similar find each other. And these might be people who are otherwise marginalized and don't have that community like with them in their physical space. So there are a lot of people who would lose that community, which is one thing that I think is very concerning, that support that they have. The other thing is that obviously influencers have a livelihood and they can make their career out of TikTok. And so that is another, people might just literally lose their livelihood. So I think that like both the community it serves for users, and also the source of, a life that it provides for influencers are two major material ways in which it affects, people across the country and the globe.
I totally agree with that. And just to add on to that, more than on an economic level with people's livelihoods, if we think about content creators, it really impacts their ability to express themselves and feel heard. It impacts their ability to participate in our public discourse and conversation in the way that they want to. And not to be so kind of whatever about it, but like these are core aspects of what it means to be in a democracy, right? And you know, I think it likewise have an impact on social movements, nonprofit organizations that use TikTok to get the message out and mobilize support for causes. You know, especially among younger people that TikTok attracts. And again, some lawmakers were very clear that the ban was at least partially motivated by concerns around what content was popular on TikTok, and you know, we should pay attention to that. I think in addition to creators, it will have a huge impact on the public, all of us as recipients of content. That's everyone who goes to TikTok to learn about new things, to hear from their favorite creators, to engage with the communities that they care about. That's politics and activism, but it's also art and entertainment. And I think there's a tendency to think, well, TikTok, it's just whatever viral dance videos and memes, and is that really important? There's of course other stuff going on, but even those things are really important. Viral dance videos and memes are part of culture and culture building, and it's really dangerous when the government tries to kind of clamp down on that. And finally, just to go maybe a bit more macro, it's likely to have an impact on our country's credibility and standing. Banning foreign media, again, that's a tactic of repressive regimes, not democracies. And the TikTok ban is a real gift to authoritarians around the world, who are going to cite to this very law to justify restrictions on their own citizens' right to access information and ideas from abroad. So, we should be concerned about this law as Americans who engage with one another on social media, but we should also be concerned about the kind of global system of free expression.
George, I'm so glad that you bring up that more macro point. I think many of us don't want to really look at the possibility of authoritarian red flags, or that authoritarian and autocratic practices can really take root here in the United States. It's a pretty basic psychological reaction, like, oh, that happens over there in these other regions of the world. And it's really important to identify that the narrowing of acceptable avenues for inquiry and connection are one of the earliest signs of authoritarianism. We've seen it when countries shut off access to apps like Signal or WhatsApp, when those in power leverage their connections to create an environment and media system that only prioritizes certain viewpoints. And I really am so glad that you mentioned the connection here between what feels at times like a nice to have, a kind of like, oh, privilege. We have one of many options for social media platforms. But when we begin as a government picking and choosing which ones are available to communities, that really edges towards authoritarian practice. And it gives our US government what seems to be a kind of unfettered control over information. And that's really concerning. So thank you for bringing that piece of it up. It really, I think, opens us nicely to some questions that we've started receiving in the chat. And again, we now have like 10 questions. Please keep going. I'm going to probably merge a few of these just for time, because I want to make sure that Yanni and George can really speak to them. I want to start with a question that we've received, echoed in a few of these, around whether this is sort of the beginning of further bans or actions that are attempts to, by the Trump administration that we've seen in previous years, shut down things like WeChat. And so I'm curious from either of you, do you expect that we will see more bans, more efforts that attempt to crack down on speech or narrow free expression?
I'll just start, I guess. So I think as for the question of whether this will lead to new bans, I think part of the question is up in the air, and I guess part of what is pernicious about this law and the decision upholding the law is that it absolutely makes those bans viable, right? It's actually hard to see what the stopping point is. Future bans of social media platforms are possible, but maybe also other forms of media too. It's really hard to see where that logic stops, and maybe it's hard to imagine now, but think about there are a number of sort of apps that we might use that are foreign owned, Swedish owned Spotify, French owned BeReal. Sure, maybe right now it's hard to imagine the US in an adversarial relationship with those countries, but what's to stop the US government from shutting those down? You mentioned WeChat. I think that's sort of maybe an obvious kind of next step. And I know that's an app that is used by many Americans to stay in touch with family around the world, and those are really concerning. But as I said in the beginning, I think the most pernicious thing about this is that it really opens the door to, really it blesses the government's ability and authority to shut down entire platforms for speech, on pretty vague national security justifications.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off that too. Particularly while we have a president who has expressed interest in erecting more barriers between countries and being very protectionalist. I think that there's always a creeping concern of this. And I'll just note that I use WeChat to communicate with pretty much all of my family in China. So I would be very worried about that. The other thing, and I apologize if this is in the weeds, but to George's point about kind of this being a tipping effect for future laws or bad law to be on the books. One thing I found pretty disturbing about the opinion as a whole is that it essentially said, this passes strict scrutiny, which is the highest level of scrutiny that a court will use to evaluate whether, an encroachment on constitutional rights is permissible by the government. And I think that's like, that should be very rare. And so the fact that it was granted here with very little substantiation besides, Congress had reasons, that is really concerning. And I actually think that's potentially why you see Judge Srinivasan writing a concurrence where he tries to walk it back, where he says, this actually this is under intermediate scrutiny and it passes under this. And I think a lot of that is worrying about spinning out into bad law, like the ones that George might have previewed.
Well, a couple more questions have come in regarding the specific case, the legal side, and I want to focus in on those and then turn back to some broader global issues. And I'm going to, again, merge two questions we've received regarding some of the arguments and the viability of those arguments for TikTok. There was a Fifth Amendment argument made in the case regarding property. And in addition, we've received a question about whether political speech on TikTok could have made a stronger case for protecting it. I'm curious, let's start with Yanni and then move to George. And again, we only have 15 minutes here left, a number of questions that are coming in still. But I'm curious, Yanni, can you break down what the Fifth Amendment argument was that TikTok made? And then maybe George, if you want to turn to the question of whether political speech on TikTok could have been a viable argument that they made as well.
Yeah, for sure. So the Fifth Amendment argument is something called the takings argument. And essentially, a takings argument is essentially that the government can't take away something from people, the US, without any kind of just compensation. And so you mostly see it in like land cases where, like there's a beach and the government says, actually, we want to reclaim this. It's extremely hard to win that kind of claim. So I think it's there. I think it's a fair claim. I'm not really, it was the harder one to win on. So I think, was there any other part of that question that I just missed?
No, I want to turn it to George for just a little bit of the question of possible arguments on political speech.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's no question that a lot of political speech and discourse happens over TikTok. And I think that is one of the strongest arguments for why this has serious First Amendment concerns. That said, I don't want to undervalue the stuff that isn't I guess, obviously political speech. Again, I mentioned dance videos, whatever, maybe people talking about movies they saw, books they read, even just little pieces of gossip. These are all parts of how we engage with one another in our society and in a democracy. And, those have just as much value as sort of overtly political speech as well. So, if someone comes back to you with the argument that banning TikTok is no big deal because it's just these whatever inane dance videos, first of all, that's not true, but also those dance videos, do matter for the millions of people around the world and in the US who consume them and enjoy them and, use those videos as a jumping off point for their own thinking and creativity.
Thank you both. Well, a question that we've gotten, and I can't help but turn to it, is whether this is all being set up for another by Elon Musk. And you're both laughing, I see on mute, but I'm curious, either of you, please jump in. And then I'm happy to also offer a little of my own take on this, moderator's privilege, but I'm curious for George or Yanni, please jump in.
I'm laughing because I think Nora and I talked about this earlier this morning. Yeah, it was a great question. I think no. It's a lot of money on the table. I think I don't know if he has it. I think someone brought it up earlier. It might have to be like a group of people who do it. He also, I mean, yeah, I think there'd be a lot. I'm not able to parse it out right now, but my gut answer is just no. But
I think I don't have particular thoughts about about an Elon buy, but I think it just highlights the point that I think all of us discussed earlier, which is that we shouldn't think about a TikTok sale as really solving any of these problems, and the idea of changing alleged, I guess, bite dance content manipulation for some other billionaire owner's manipulation isn't really my idea of like of a good time. So whether it's Elon, whether it's someone else, I kind of think it doesn't really matter because it is the government essentially saying no, this organization, this group, this person can't own this platform, but maybe someone else can, and that's government manipulation in precisely the same sort of way that I guess the DC Circuit is or the law is aimed towards alleged Chinese manipulation.
Well, I know a few additional factors at play here. Semaphore did an article that valued TikTok at $100 billion, and that there are individuals like Frank McCourt saying that they've been courting a variety of players to pull together what is called the People's Bid. That money could be pulled from foundations, endowments, pension funds, maybe even public support to buy TikTok. A couple of things here. 100 billion is a different number than we saw from way back in October and December of 2023, when TikTok was valued more like 200 plus billion. And so a couple of things here. As Yanni mentioned, the price tag, whether it's 100 billion or 200 plus billion, is really huge, much bigger than what Elon bought Twitter for. And although he's one of the richest people in the world, my sense politically is that, he's moved on. I mean, he's excited about his role as a quasi-government player, advising Trump about efficiency. He's thinking about, traveling through space and, colonization in that realm. And so I think what is more concerning, as George sort of flicks out a little bit, is who else might buy TikTok if it ultimately comes to that. And that's where our growing set of concerns, Free Press and others, is whether something like the People's Bid really represents the people's interests. It sounds nice. That sounds wonderful. I'd love the People's Bid. But if the People's Bid is developed and architected by a billionaire himself, I guess that somehow slightly flies in the face of it being an actual people's bid. So I'm keen for us to continue watching this, and I'm curious as we just slowly begin to close out. Can we talk a little bit about what deadlines and happenings will occur in January? I believe there are some things we're queued up for. Yanni, can I turn it to you?
Yeah, so I think that the formal deadline is that January 6th deadline to divest. Whether or not that'll actually be an effective deadline is obviously up to a lot of a lot of the litigation that will play out soon. So it's not necessarily clear exactly what the precise date are, but I can give some contours of what might happen soon. So the emergency motion for an injunction filed by the Supreme Court. That will essentially, I checked the docket before this. They haven't given a schedule out, but as soon as they do, I'd imagine that they try to rule on that soon. And so I think you might be seeing kind of, briefing on the injunction matter within the week, maybe sooner, maybe a little longer, but I've seen it as short as a week. So I think that'll be like the next immediate step. And then I think from there, we can kind of move on to see what the other kind of triggering deadlines are, but that'll be the first one.
Do you think there's any possibility that the Trump administration would make a move on this? I know that just yesterday, the CEO of ByteDance was visiting Trump. No one has commented, on what happened at that meeting, but we've gotten in the chat, and frankly, I'm curious to hear both of you, since Trump has himself just gone back and forth and waffled. He has said previously that he really needs to look into the matter, or he really likes TikTok, and curious to hear from you both what might be happening.
So yeah, I mean, I don't think we should look to Trump to to save us or to save TikTok. It's true that I've seen similar reports that maybe he's on the fence or maybe even in favor of trying to pull it back a little bit. But we should remember that in 2020, he was among the first to propose banning TikTok, and more generally. I think it's a real mistake to invest government officials with such broad authority to restrict citizens from accessing foreign media platforms. That's a power that can be readily abused by anyone who wants to manipulate and distort domestic political debate. And I think we should be deeply concerned about the way that power might be abused in this country in the future. So, look, if Trump opposes the ban, as he has said at some points, he should press Congress to repeal the law, right? Maybe there are elements of the law that provide him with some discretion in how he enforces it and how the DOJ argues it. But again, the broader point is that investing the authority to shut down an extremely popular social media platform in any government official, no matter who, sets a really dangerous precedent. And Trump might decide not to enforce the TikTok ban on day one, but he could also change his mind at any moment. And the real answer is to not have this type of ban at all, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there is cushion, certainly, both in the law and with how enforcement works for Trump to do something. But that as an institutional, like we shouldn't be relying on that because it's just one person, as opposed to kind of some of the more institutional guardrails we have. I also just wanted to mention to Nora, to your question of deadlines, I just went back and checked. The TikTok did ask for a response from the Supreme Court by January 6th. So if they have to, proceed with divestment, that they could do that. So sorry, I missed that one.
I mean, we're dealing with truly breaking legal news every few days here in this case. So it presents a tremendous opportunity to come back to you both in the coming weeks. And I think we have time for one more quick question. I'm gonna just tie a few of these together, which is, if the Supreme Court ends up hearing this and granting cert in the case, a number of questions that we've gotten in the Q&A have hinted at the Supreme Court being put at risk, and particularly the tensions between national security interests and the First Amendment. Do you think that will play a factor when or if the Supreme Court does hear this case?
I think at the very least, it does play a factor in whether or not it will grant cert to hear the case. I think for sure the fact that national security is being implicated here kind of puts it in that category I kind of spoke about earlier about important questions that have kind of national interest. So I think at the very least it gets put there, as opposed to the calculus, or as for the calculus between national security and the First Amendment. The DC Circuit, they found it one way. There have been other courts in the past that have kind of found the balance to tip the other way. I don't know about this Supreme Court and how they would balance it out. But yeah, I think there are two extremely live issues for any court, and they tend to be kind of like pillars of concerns. So when you have to confront both of them at the same time, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'll add here is that, I think we should be really concerned whenever there are these sort of broad invocations of national security as a justification to shut down speech, and particularly entire speech platforms. And unfortunately, this country has a long history of this. In the Cold War, there were lots of restrictions on the kinds of books and periodicals that were coming into the country from adversary nations. In the post 9/11 period, there were all kinds of invocations of national security to justify restricting, people and ideas from coming into the country, and of course, you're restricting the kinds of speech that and speech activities that Americans can engage in. So, I think we should be really concerned about that whenever we see it. It seems to be happening more and more abroad too, and so. I hope that if the Supreme Court does take the case, that they, seriously consider the national security implications, but also don't view that as this, just broad trump card that trumps all other interests. Part of what we look to the Supreme Court and really all courts to do is stand up for our constitutional rights in this way.
Well, that's a daunting but great point to end on. That yes, we hope our democratic institutions continue to uphold the rule of law and protect our constitutional rights. That is the premise of this country and our government. So we have 1 minute left. I want to close us out here. First, I want to thank George and Yanni. They are in the weeds, in the trenches here, and are just tremendous experts on the law. So thank you both for joining us, for offering your time and your expertise. I want to turn to our audience and thank you all for joining us. It feels sometimes when you hear about these types of developments like there's no action to take. But I would start, for those that are interested, in sharing more about this issue. And then I think the real invitation in 2025 will be for all of us to protect and advance in our own life the way that free expression touches us. We believe that the assaults on free expression and the First Amendment will not go away. And in fact, as we saw with the first Trump administration, there were concerted state and federal efforts to weaken our constitutional rights, and particularly the First Amendment. So we anticipate more of that coming with the 47th presidency. This hangs as a sort of dark cloud that suggests the potential direction we may see our First Amendment rights going. And as we continue down this path, we, Free Press, will be hosting more events, more education and resources for all of you. When we're, in court or on the street, we will be connecting with all of you. This is the stuff that, reminds me of why we were created. So thank you both, and thank you for the work that you are doing to protect our rights, our basic rights, and all of the lofty ways that translates. So thank you all for being here.